Those of you who are here in the sanctuary or have ever been in our sanctuary may notice that each of our pews has a number on the back. Do you see them? Now, does anyone know why there are numbers? Yeah, that's right. I knew we had some history people in here. It used to be that members of the church would pay to rent a pew for their family. And the numbers helped you to find your family's pew, because you wouldn't want to go in the wrong one, right? And of course, different pews cost different amounts depending on how close they were or how far. Did you get a good view? Could you hear the choir? All that good stuff. And this was the major way that the church was funded. Now, obviously, we don't do that anymore. The way that churches are funded has changed drastically over the last 150 years. After the end of pew rentals, churches shifted to getting their funding through donations, which is still what we do. Luckily for the churches of that time, being part of a church was deeply ingrained in the culture, almost mandatory. And churches were just about the only thing out there for you to give money to, so it was an easy choice. Also, a lot of them had that whole salvation thing wrapped up in it, so you really had to give your money there, right? Now, fast forward to now, when church is very much optional, an option that the majority of people do not choose. And we all receive at least 5 emails, phone calls, text messages, or snail mail letters a day from worthy organizations seeking funds to further their mission. Church fundraising is a very different landscape than it was even 20 years ago. The proliferation of options for charitable donations has spawned a whole category of organizations that rate nonprofits to help you choose which is the most worthy of your money. Now, often one of the things these ratings talk about is how much of that money is given to the mission and how much goes to overhead, or keeping the organization going. The idea is, of course, in these ratings at least, that you want as much money as possible to go to support the mission and as little as possible to support the infrastructure. Now, having done nonprofit budgeting for the past 9 years as your minister and having served on boards of 3 other nonprofits, I find this dichotomy to be totally unhelpful. It was designed really with very large nonprofits in mind, places like the Red Cross, where people started to get curious about how many of those dollars that they gave to disaster relief were actually going to disaster relief rather than to more fundraising. The difference between overhead and mission in churches and other small nonprofits is not so stark as this. In fact, I think you could likely go through our budget and categorize 90+% of the budget as mission, or 90+% of the budget as overhead, depending on how it is that you try to define it. I love the way that my colleague, the Reverend Heidi Carrington-Heath, reframes this dichotomy for us. There's a lot of talk, she says, about organizational overhead and the cost of staff. And I want to gently remind us all that work gets done by people. It takes resources and structure. By all means, she says, research who you support, ask good questions, and know that healthy organizations won't hesitate to answer them. But this idea that we don't need to support staff salaries, that nonprofit employees should live in poverty, or that good work gets done at the least possible cost is one I hope we can move beyond. Overhead, in many cases, she says, equals people. Paying a living wage and benefits is absolutely a responsible use of money. As Heidi points out, what we call overhead is actually often the essential workings of any nonprofit. Yes, we pay a lot of money to have a building, but as long as the building is serving our mission, these costs are essential to our mission. Yes, we pay even more money for staff, but as long as the staff are serving our mission, that too is mission-focused spending. But even if we get past these categorizations of mission and overhead when it comes to church fundraising, there is another hurdle, which is that people, and especially Unitarian Universalists, often don't think of giving to their church as a way of furthering justice. If you're a Unitarian Universalist and you're trying to figure out how to give your money to most effectively save the world, church often doesn't top the list. We already got salvation, right? I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the people who directly benefit from congregations are also the people who are funding those congregations, right? Like you. You are both of those people. Unlike most nonprofits, you are both giving to make the organization exist and using the services that the organization makes possible. In most nonprofits, that's not true. You have two separate sets of people who are in those categories. And there is something about giving to ourselves that feels hard or bad or just not quite right. It certainly doesn't sound like the path to justice and equity is giving to ourselves, right? This is why I think we sometimes stray into consumer language for talking about church fundraising, inviting people to think about what it is that you get from the congregation. What does this church mean to you? What does being part of this church, how does being part of this church make you feel? What value does church have in your life? Very individual-centered, right? Now, there's nothing terrible about talking about the value of church in this way. I actually hope you do think about that. I think that's important. And I hope it is meaningful to you and does inspire you to give. But I also think that perhaps the more important and more mission-focused question would be, how does the world benefit from having this congregation around? What value does it bring to our larger community? Because the way that we work is not actually consumer-based at all. You don't have to pay per worship service you attend or per kid you enroll in faith formation. In fact, you don't have to pay at all. Instead, you're invited to receive what you need from the congregation and give what you can. This is one of the ways we try to practice equity within our community. You don't get a better worship experience or more pastoral care because you give more money. So when you give, you are really giving to support the whole work of the church, not the specific part that you might benefit from, but actually everything that we do. And this includes so many things that are all about justice. The work of our church is offering age-appropriate comprehensive sexuality education to everyone from kindergartners through adults. It's teaching about consent and bodily autonomy and how to have healthy relationships. We have another group of 4th through 6th graders upstairs right now beginning that journey. The work of our church is showing up and speaking out, testifying for trans rights and abortion access and the abolition of slavery even as punishment for a crime. The work of our church is offering our space, our building, to recovery groups, to those organizing for affordable housing and immigrant justice, to those who are out on the streets in the cold this winter. In the midst of a world that seeks to dehumanize and demoralize and tell us that we don't matter, the work of our church is reminding people, reminding you every week that you are loved and worthy of love, that you matter, that you are whole and holy just the way you are. And I would say it is the work of our church to model being a good employer, offering fair wages, generous benefits, and a caring and humane work environment. I will never forget the board meeting more than 6 years ago when I shared that I was expecting a baby for the first time, and at the same time asked the board to reconsider the 6 weeks of paid leave that were in my contract. I was very nervous for a number of reasons, but perhaps most of all because I knew that even 6 weeks of paid leave is a whole lot more than most people get after a child joins their family. I knew that, and I also knew that 6 weeks wasn't enough. I knew that I would not be at the point where I would be ready to go back to the demands of full-time ministry. And also, as the primary wage earner in my household, that we could not afford for me to take unpaid time. So even though I was nervous, I asked the board to consider amending my contract to extend that paid leave. And let me tell you, they responded more thoughtfully and generously than I had ever anticipated. They brushed aside my initial suggestion of 8 weeks and insisted on 12. And what struck me most about this was their reasoning. It was not just that they wanted to offer this to me in particular, or to any staff or ministers that they had in the future, but that they saw this as a justice issue. If we were going to go out in the world and work for justice, they said, we needed to be practicing that in our own congregation. How powerful is that? And so they took a little stand for justice in that meeting and instituted a 12-week paid parental leave policy for all of our staff, no matter how new they were or how many hours they worked. I was so grateful and proud that night to work for this congregation. That truly is what it looks like to lead with love. It's that kind of leading with love that our stewardship campaign is inviting you all into this year with this focus on staff salaries. I am so looking forward to you all hearing more about each of our staff over the next few weeks. And at the same time, I hope you are inspired to give not just because of the particular people. I know for a fact that they are a wonderful set of people, so that might be really hard. But I hope that you're inspired to give because you see modeling fair and generous compensation as part of the work of this church. Yet another way that we can lead with love. May we, as a congregation, continue to lead with love, building a more just and equitable world both within our community and beyond our walls. May it be so.